Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and we are pleased to bring you another episode of Scholar Talks. For this episode, we are honored to have scholar Jonathan Den Hartog, who is going to discuss the Republican principles of the American Revolution, related to his important essay in the new BRI textbook, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Jonathan, welcome.
Well, thank you, Tony. It's a delight to be here, especially as I know these are designed to be a service to both the general public and especially those teachers who are working in the classroom.
All right, indeed, yes, we hope that our teachers and students will be watching. And we've had a lot of people sign up already, so we're very pleased. Well, let me introduce you. Jonathan Den Hartog is a professor of history and the department chair at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama. He previously taught in St. Paul, Minnesota at the University of Northwestern for 13 years. He received his PhD in American history from the University of Notre Dame, and he's a specialist in American political and religious history. He is the author of Patriotism and Piety, Federalist Politics and Religious Struggle in the New American Nation, and the co-editor of Disestablishment and Religious Dissent, Church-State Relations in the New American States. He's married to Jacqueline, and they have 4 children. So again, Jonathan, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks.
Should we dive right in?
Let's do it.
All right, good. All right, so my first question is, can you provide some historical context for our viewers by explaining how the French and Indian War helped lead to the American Revolution?
Yes, I like to start my narrative of the revolutionary period with the French and Indian War, which really spans from 1754-55 down to the peace treaty in 1763. There had been many wars on the North American continent before. Often it was the British colonies versus the French colonies, or the British colonies versus the Spanish colonies. But the French and Indian War turns out to be a different type of conflict in that it starts in the New World, but ends up spreading to Europe, where it's known as the 7 Years' War. And really, it spans the globe because fighting happens also in the Caribbean, on the coast of Africa, and even in India. So there are ways in which we can consider the French and Indian War the First World War. And so it spans multiple years. It sees much colonial activity supporting the war. Many colonists fight. And then the British are victorious, which gives great joy to the colonists because they feel like they've helped this great endeavor by the British Empire, right? It's great to think of them as British patriots celebrating this victory. And part of that victory is that by treaty, France gives to Great Britain all of Canada. All of New France now becomes the British Canada. And once again, you would say this is a great success. But in all of that victory, it raises new challenges that will have to be addressed. And in addressing those challenges, I think actually in the failure to address those challenges, we see the groundwork laid for the conflict that will lead to the American Revolution. So just to give some examples of that, the biggest one, of course, is finances, right? That fighting a world war for 7 years has emptied the British treasury, and so the chancellors of the exchequer, those holding the funds, as well as even just parliamentary leaders, realize we need to do something to recoup British finances. And part of that, they're going to look to the colonies. The colonies have benefited from defense and from the spending of so much treasure. Maybe they should come along and give help and support financially. And so this is going to raise financial questions. I think there are other dynamics at work, though, too. The fact that there's no longer a French threat to the north gives both the colonists and the British government a little bit more of a free hand. Both sides feel a little bit less constrained, which will allow that conflict to percolate further. And I think it's really significant that many of the units that had fought in the French and Indian War, the British regular units, are actually left in the colonies. And so now you have a much larger force, and sometimes stationed in population centers like Boston, New York, elsewhere, but especially Boston, where they can also become on one hand, a tool of British control, on the other, a flashpoint for colonial conflict. So all of these dynamics start to feed into a challenge for how will Britain handle the post-war settlement. And as they, I think, as they bobble it, you're going to see conflict that's going to push us further and further towards a revolution.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, and the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, just a series of taxes, all attempts by Parliament to tax the colonies. And the colonists, of course, complain that they're being taxed without their consent, right? The old cry that we all learned at a young age of no taxation without representation. And this idea of consent is deeply rooted in the principles of and civic virtues of republicanism. And I really would love for you to explore that concept. What is republicanism? And how did it shape American thinking about that relationship you described with Great Britain going into the 1760s and 1770s?
Right. And so we see just a great connection we have from that financial challenge to now things like the Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, the Sugar Act, the Tea Act. All of these are first of all taxes. So and then is there a legitimacy there? That's the question. And as you mentioned, the cry of no taxation without representation really appears as early as 1765 with the Stamp Act controversy. So it's not like they had to hunt around for a phrase that would work, but it's there from very early on. And then as we think of, well, what are the ideals? What are the ideas that kind of motivate the revolution? I'm going to argue that the key piece really is this ideal of republicanism. And now as a historian, I always have to qualify that and say, of course, there are other pieces in the recipe. You can talk about the commitment to the British common law and constitutionalism, the importance of a thinker like John Locke, who feeds into this, even Protestant theology feeds into this. But what holds it together, what puts it together, is this concept of republicanism. And so I think it's really important to kind of camp out there. What is it? Well, the first thing I always like to say is it's not simply what we think of as the Republican Party. So we need to distinguish or draw that. That's not what we're talking about. Instead, it's a kind of a complex idea of beliefs about politics that has a long history. Again, Americans didn't invent it. They look back to ancient Rome, right? So there's a classical impulse of the Roman Republic and its ideals. There's a Renaissance theme. Renaissance Florence was proud to be a republic. And then it had English advocates, John Milton as a Republican thinker, or Harrington, the author of Oceana, right? These are English writers who are then carried forward into the 1700s. And even in the 1700s, there are British writers advancing these ideas. People who published, like Trenchard and Gordon published a newspaper that was then read in the colonies. So what did this say? Well, I would highlight the importance of self-government for liberty. Self-government for liberty as being at the heart of republicanism. There's a great concern to preserve liberty because there are threats to self-governing liberty. This could be a concentration of unchecked political power. If you give any person or any group too much political power, they will abuse it. But they also believed that money could be too overwhelming, that too much accumulation of money in a few hands could constrain liberty. Why is that? When you give too much power to certain people, they're apt to abuse it. And the language that they use is they will actually enslave others, that the opposite of liberty is slavery. And so that needs to be really guarded against. So you need to guard against that. You also need to develop a certain type of citizen, that self-government means every citizen has a responsibility to be engaged, thoughtful, and self-sacrificing. That there's a concept that the republic, the public things, have a common good, that everyone has a duty to contribute to this. So it's not just about the structure of government, although that's really important. It's about engaged citizens actively promoting self-government for liberty. It turns out that this is very compatible with much of the other thinking going on in the colonies, especially the Protestant Christianity that's dominant in the colonies at the time. This comports really well. So Americans are reading these ideas, they're talking about these ideas, and it's, I think, really shaping their political outlook. Then when things start to happen, when acts start to come down from the British government, Stamp Act, Townshend duties, it's like raising this alarm. It triggers a response. This looks like an abuse of power. Our job must be to push back and resist it.
Excellent. Yeah. So self-governing citizens and virtuous leaders, which brings me to my next question. Your essay really narrates, and unfortunately we don't have time to go through all the dramatic battles of the Revolutionary War, and really how the outcome of that war was never predetermined. I mean, it really sort of balanced on the edge of a knife for so long, for so many years during that 8-year struggle. And can you explain the role that General George Washington played in using his virtuous character to mold this, what I would call a Republican army? He defers to civilian authorities. He shapes that continental vision within the army. He seems to be that virtuous Republican, almost Roman statesman, if you will, Roman general, Cincinnatus, right? And so, can you explain a little bit about his significance in the Continental Army?
Right, and again, in the essay, that was a piece I was really trying to emphasize, the drama and the contingency of the war for independence. That as Americans, we tend to say, well, of course it was going to happen because, well, we're Americans. But from 1775 to 1781, there was no guarantee that it would turn out as it did. So we do have to give credit to those who helped it succeed. And here at the very top of the list, we have to put Washington. Washington was the indispensable man for independence. People at the time called him the father of his country. And I think that's great. That's greatly true. That he was, his value, his worth was recognized at the time, and I think we do well to continue to acknowledge that virtue. And I think you're right to say that it grew out of him having internalized those ideals first. That even though he's not a great essayist like John Adams or Thomas Jefferson, yet he thought about political matters. He was a reader. The library at Mount Vernon attests to this, and he really did prize that self-government for liberty, as well as you say, the classical ideals that undergirded it. Some of his favorite literature was classical literature and other plays that memorialized classical virtues. So he had to confront, how do you build a Republican army that is going to function while fighting, right? I mean, he didn't have a year, 5 years to plan. He had to construct this while they were trying to fight the war. So assemble the airplane while it's flying would be a modern analogy. And the fact that he does this, I think, really, again, attests to skill and wisdom as a leader. Where to put that value? Let's just kind of highlight the kind of three components you mentioned. First of all, he developed a Republican army. Okay, so how do you lead an army of free citizens? And what he realized is that the American army has to function differently than a European army, where people were just trained to obey. Your commanding officer tells you do this and you do it. And what American commanders found was you couldn't do that. One, you had to, if there were decisions to be made, you did have to have consultation, either with officers or sometimes even with your men. Also, you had to explain what you were doing. Washington really realizes that a Republican army needs to be led, not ordered. So creating a Republican army. Second, he realized that he had to develop a Republican response to civil leadership. What are the civil military relations going to be? And he consistently deferred to Congress on political decisions, that there has to be civil control of the military. However, on the actual operational side of things, the military should give good feedback to Congress and should have the leeway to operate as it sees fit. So different realms of responsibility: political decisions for political decision makers, military decisions for the military. Now, the place where this was challenged the most actually comes at the end of the war, after Yorktown, when the army is in barracks in Newburgh, New York. And it turns out that Congress has been really slow to support the army, slow to send it the finances it needs. And there are some officers who are grumbling. And there's the threat. It's called the Newburgh Conspiracy. Some question how much of a conspiracy it was, but the Newburgh Conspiracy to threaten Congress. And what does Washington do? Washington totally stops it by appealing to their Republican virtue. He says, if I've sacrificed for the country, you can too. Basically, he says, I've grown old in the service of my country, so I hope you'll listen to me. So civil military relations that endure in America. And then third, that point about a continental vision. I think for the country going forward, it becomes so important that it has officers, an officer group from all of the states. It's not just one region, it's all of the states. They all serve together with Washington. They develop ties with people from other states. And they realize that we have more in common than differences, and that the country is going to work better if we're all collaborating rather than if we all do our own thing. So the continental vision that happens through working together, I think will then pay off in the coming decade as there's a move for a stronger national government. So, and again, who's at the heart of all this? It's Washington, and that's why he deserves the credit.
The indispensable man.
Yes.
And your last comment led me right to my next question. And so the Americans win the war. They secure their independence, their nationhood. And yet this new republic, its first constitution, the Articles of Confederation, really seemed inadequate to the task of actually governing a nation. And so what were some of the challenges, or what were some of the problems of the 1780s that Americans faced?
There's drama in the 1780s as well, because we've won the war. We're independent. Terrific. What do we do with it? that's the challenge, that people aren't sure. Again, there's no blueprint for how to do this. And so there's this question, are we starting from scratch, right? Are we kind of throw out everything that we had as colonies? But that doesn't seem right, because there was a lot in the late colonial period that we liked, that we were actually trying to preserve. So you have to sift through, what do we keep? What do we disregard? There's a question. How do we rebuild our economy? 1780s has an economic depression because the trade ties, both between the states and with England in the British trading empire, are gone. So trade has to be reestablished. And then simply population and society has to settle back down. There have been a lot of people who had been refugees during the war, and many who had supported Britain had left the country. So there's just a lot of instability there. On top of that, the Articles of Confederation Congress is not doing a very good job. I mean, to be blunt, in large part, that's because the way the articles are structured have created a very, very weak confederacy. So they really don't have the power to do very much, or really to reform themselves. And I think that's going to prove to be a real governmental problem. Great example of that has to do, again, with money. Isn't it interesting? The lack of money for Britain leads us to the revolution. The lack of finances for the Articles of Confederation Congress pushes a sense for a new government. The Articles of Confederation Congress doesn't have the power to tax. What can they do? They can request money from the states. And I always like to say, well, if the states say, no, sorry, we can't do that, what happens? And the answer is nothing, right? There's no teeth there. So Congress had borrowed a lot of money to fight the war, but now they're not in a position to repay it. So that's a problem. And just at this time, when people are realizing these real weaknesses, greater unrest happens. And one of the key examples of that unrest happens in Massachusetts, when there's a Western Massachusetts farmers revolt under Daniel Shays, right? We think of it as Shays's revolt. It's just an internal Massachusetts problem. Actually, Massachusetts tried to increase taxes and foreclose on some farmers. But for many leaders who are observing things, they say, well, if you have unrest in Massachusetts, maybe it spreads. So we need now a stronger government to bring domestic tranquility, right? To keep the peace, because clearly the structures that we have aren't working right now. And so then it falls to leaders from various states to think and act about what they might do instead of the Articles of Confederation.
Right. Okay, and what they decide to do is attend the Constitutional Convention, right? And so this Constitutional Convention and the ratifying conventions, you know, I think they're just such a great deliberative movement by the people and their representatives about, you know, the kind of government they want. And it's really like nothing before seen in the history of the world, where people, as Alexander Hamilton says in Federalist Paper #1, it's by reflection and choice, right, rather than accident or force. And so what Republican principles continue to animate, you know, the framers of this new Constitution, and even the ratification debate on both sides?
Yeah. I think Federalist #1 is a great place to start, because Hamilton is asking that question, right? Is self-government possible? Do we have the capacity as rational, engaged citizens to see our way through to a government that will last for the long term, right? So, I mean, it's posing the question, can can Republican self-government for liberty work for our independent country? So that, I think, by itself is the question. And so if that's the question, then how do you do it? Well, there's a recognition that you need some power in your government. It needs to have energy to do certain things. Provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare as a means to providing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to riff on the Constitution's preamble. So you need some energy, some power to do that. But remember, everyone is also suspicious of giving too much power to someone else. That's part of the revolutionary legacy. We're wary of entrusting other groups with too much power. So how do you do this? How do you construct a government that has power to do certain things, probably involving taxes, which no one will like, but yet limit it so it doesn't go astray? And so these are the questions, I think, that are active at the Constitutional Convention and then in the ratification debates, which I agree are really just amazing moments when citizens across the country debate central basic governmental points. Now, I think here some of the things that we always talk about in the Constitution fit into this, right? So you separate powers, for instance, that if you're concerned about power being abused, you don't give it all to one person. You separate it into several branches, right? Which is an innovation. Under the Articles, you only had Congress. Now you're going to have 2 houses of Congress, a bicameral Congress. You're going to have a presidency, and you're going to have a Supreme Court that will be independent as well. So you're bringing together, you're separating powers just right there. Further, you're going to build in mechanisms so that each of those branches can check the other. So checks and balances are also a Republican mechanism to make sure that power doesn't get abused, which is, anyone can draw the lines where Congress can check the presidency, the president can veto a law, the courts can step in and address it. These are designed to equip and empower citizens for self-government to produce liberty. As I'm thinking about this, well, are these commented on any places? Well, it turns out the Federalist Papers are one of the best examples of reflecting on these Republican dilemmas. And some of these ideas I was talking about really root in places like Federalist number 10 and Federalist number 51, that these are great touchstones for these theories. And what Hamilton and Madison and John Jay are saying is that the Constitution provides a Republican remedy for these problems. Now, their opponents, right, are the Anti-Federalists, and they're opposed to the Constitution but they share some of the same values of protecting individuals, protecting self-government, protecting liberty, and a wariness of too much power. And so the debate, I think, between them is what is a safe grant of power? How much is too much? Does the proposed Constitution go too far? Do we trust that the national government will stay within its bounds? How much trust do we have in these institutions? And I think it's fair to say that the Federalists believe, yes, there's enough checks in place. The Anti-Federalists are more skeptical, right? Even someone like Patrick Henry in Virginia, he points out that these powers, once given, would have a tendency to expand, so you need to be very wary of them. So on this Republican ground, the two sides are still disagreeing. In the end, the citizens make what I think is a prudential and principled decision that no, adopting this Constitution is better for our country going forward. What happens to the Anti-Federalists? Most of them agree. Most of them will come around. They will support the new government, but they'll do so out of that wariness. We had better be involved just to make sure that it follows through on its promises. And of course, some of those debates about how it's going to function flare up immediately in the 1790s, which is beyond our discussion today, but will be exactly where those questions come to bear, what the federal government should do and what it's empowered to do under the Constitution.
Right. And I think that's a really great lesson for today, right? That they needed to see that even when they differed on the actual application of power or, policies in the 1790s, that they were still all Americans and they still all believed in Republican principles. They just disagreed a little bit over policy, or maybe just the right amount of power should be applied in certain situations. But they had a common cause, right? And they were all in it together, and they all believed in the same ideals.
They were really aiming to get I think to the same place, right? Self-government for liberty. It was a question of means, not so much ends.
Right. Good. And the Republican these principles we've been talking about, liberty and equality, justice, consent, they're not always equally applied to all people in America. And so can you explain some of those difficult failures to secure those rights for all Americans?
And I think some people watching this might say, well, you've been talking a lot about the white male citizen, right? The soldiers, the voters. What about the rest of Americans? And I think on one hand, it's a good question to ask. I do think at the time it was these questions about Republican liberty that were most central to the public discourse. But once you articulate those principles, then you do have to ask, how are they carried out? How do they apply? So I'm going to agree with that. And of course, I'm thinking as we're recording this in 2020, there are a lot of people probably in classrooms and elsewhere asking these very questions. Were these Republican ideals simply covers for power? Were they not really believed? Was there hypocrisy being applied? And I think we need to confront that and ask those questions in a serious way. So I think two groups whose stories really matter growing out of this period. One would be white women. How do women deal and wrestle with these themes? And then also, how do African Americans in America relate to these themes? So if I can take up both of those. First of all, thinking about women, we can ask, well, wait, when the Declaration talks about all men being created equal, are women included in that? And I think in the language of the day, they were, that there was an assertion of equal humanity, and if equal humanity, then equal basic natural rights, but maybe their role would be different. And there is political thinking among women at the time. The revolutionary conflicts does sensitize women to political matters. They are politicized if they are going to participate. Maybe they'll send supplies to Boston, or maybe they will serve to support a local Revolutionary War regiment. So these are things that have them talking about politics, engaged in politics. Most of the political standing, though, is set at the state level, not the federal level. So, many people like to look to Abigail Adams. In her letter to her husband, John, in 1776, she says, remember the ladies, protect our interests, because men would be tyrants if you let them. But on some level, that doesn't fall to Congress. It doesn't even fall to the Constitutional Convention to determine those rights of voting. It falls to the states. And of course, so there you might say, oh, there's a problem there. One great example of women being involved, even from the Revolutionary period, is in the state of New Jersey. In New Jersey, from the Revolution, for several decades, unmarried women are allowed to vote, and we should remember that, and that for New Jersey, that was an application of these principles of liberty. Now, during this time, what happens for women is their kind of social, cultural, political role is defined not so much as voting, but as supporting the revolution through an ideal often called Republican motherhood. And that a Republican mother would raise children and would use them to bring them up to continue these Republican ideals. So it has to do with teaching, with character formation, right? How do you instill virtue in young people? And the answer is it starts in the home, and it starts with mothers. And so they had a very important role, even though it wasn't a voting role. So there is some discussion about the place of women and some debate, and so we should acknowledge that. In considering African Americans, here, rather than telling a singular story, I think it's important to note that there are several responses to this. I always like to remind my students, first of all, that when the revolution begins in 1776, slavery is legal in all of the colonies, even in the places that you want to think of today. Massachusetts has limited, but has slaves. New York has slaves. Pennsylvania has slaves. And so what kind of response to this call for liberty, self-government for liberty, do you get? And I think it's important to say that in the northern states, there is a recognition that slavery goes against Republican ideals. And so there are moves to oppose slavery and to end it. And in New England, I see it as very much growing out of these Republican ideals. It happens the fastest in New England. The middle states are slightly slower, but even there, right at the close of the Revolution, you see manumission societies, people saying we need to end slavery, and Alexander Hamilton's a part of that. John Jay is a part of that. That there are real pushes to end slavery, and so even in middle Atlantic states like New York, New Jersey, that's going to happen by the end of the 1700s. So one story to realize is that yes, in the North, people recognized that slavery was inconsistent with Republican ideals, and it's even worth mentioning that even Virginia debated ending slavery. It was not approved, but they did debate it. So that's one point to say. Another touchstone that people often look to is the Constitution, right? And the Constitution could have addressed slavery, but it really was not in a position to end slavery throughout the nation as a national policy. Several pieces here to talk about. First of all, there is the 3/5 clause that for purposes of apportionment and taxation, enslaved persons would be counted at a 3/5 rate. Now, I always like to emphasize that doesn't mean they were deemed 3/5 of a person, but rather that for counting purposes, they would have that weight. And that was a compromise because, again, Northerners said, well, they should either be full citizens and taxed, or if they're not citizens, they should not count for your apportionment. Whereas the South said, no, we want them to count for our seats in Congress, but not be taxed. So this was a difficult compromise that did not preclude further actions. So that would be one point. A second point to note is that the foreign slave trade is addressed in the Constitution. There is a moratorium on touching it for 20 years, but written into the Constitution is the opportunity to end the foreign slave trade 20 years hence. And I always like to point out, immediately once the opportunity occurs to end the foreign slave trade, Congress does it. So that by 1808, the foreign slave trade is ended. That's important. Now, what I think the framers didn't realize is how big the internal slave trade would become. That's a separate story. But for framing this, they saw the ability to end the foreign slave trade as a big deal. The final piece is to ask is what's the Constitution's kind of approach to slavery altogether. And here I've actually been reading a lot about this on this topic this summer. And I have to say that I'm convinced by the arguments that were advanced ultimately by Abraham Lincoln, by Frederick Douglass, and by several recent historians to say the Constitution, although it seems to tolerate slavery, does not give it its endorsement. That there's even nothing in the document itself that really approves of slavery. It might tolerate it, which is a problem, but it does not approve of it. And what that allows is that down the road, again, these are subsequent decades and subsequent stories to think about, that it is not getting in the way of dealing with slavery. And of course, those are debates for the 1830s, 40s, 50s, into the 1860s. But the Constitution, I would emphasize, tolerates slavery, makes some provisions for it, but does not endorse it. And that by itself is an important piece for American history going forward.
Jonathan Den Hartog, I really appreciate your coming on. Any of these questions by themselves have entire books written about them, or maybe even entire shelves and libraries written on them. And so you've taken us on a journey in about 30 minutes from the French and Indian War all the way up to the new nation. And so that was quite a lift, and we really appreciate that. Your essay in Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness is excellent. And I really want to thank you for coming on today.
Well, thank you. And I would definitely just commend the entire textbook to all of our viewers. Get a copy of that, use it, make good use of it. And really thanks for the opportunity to write for it and to talk with you this morning.
Thank you very much.